Hi, I'm Charles, and you're watching The State of the Republic.
This week was, frankly, one of the most terrifying weeks I've lived through so far in my life. In light of recent events in Charlottesville, Virginia, I've decided to air a special report on the history of the Southern strategy and Republican racism, so that we may better understand the societal conditions that have led us to the place we are now. Now for the news of the week. Trump has made a variety of terrible comments this week, threatening military action against Venezuela, after it was not entirely clear that he knew where Venezuela was, and also, of course, threatening war with North Korea. Make no mistake, a war with North Korea will be disastrous for everyone involved. Any serious conflict, even a non-nuclear one, would lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. In news that is slightly less terrifying, Trump finally commented this week that he was thankful to Putin for expelling U.S. diplomats because it would save the U.S. money by reducing payroll. First of all, that's not how it works. Those State Department employees continue to work for the department unless their jobs are cut on the U.S. end. Secondly, what the hell? Since when do presidents thank other countries for humiliating our nation's representatives? In ego news, Trump was revealed this week to receive a twice-daily folder of propaganda that makes him look good so he can feel better. Even Narcissus was like, that's a bit much. Despite the congressional recess, congressional Republicans are still working to screw over working people, possibly trying another ACA repeal, definitely pushing their tax cuts for the rich, and playing around with the debt ceiling again. Koch groups in particular have been making a strong push for the Republican tax cut efforts. However, McConnell and Trump recently have had a bit of a falling out, with each of them blaming the other for the Republicans' failure to pass major legislation. On the electoral front, the voters of Alabama will soon vote in the party primaries for a special Senate election. Given Alabama's heavy Republican tilt, it is likely that whoever wins the Republican primary will be the senator. The three current major Republican candidates are Roy Moore, Mo Brooks, and the incumbent appointee, Luther Strange. Moore was twice kicked off the Alabama Supreme Court for refusing to abide by higher court decisions, in other words, not doing his job. Mo Brooks is a Freedom Caucus member who suggested that people who have pre-existing conditions do not lead good lives. Luther Strange is widely suspected of making a corrupt deal not to prosecute the previous governor, who has since resigned in scandal, in exchange for the Senate appointment. The choice is yours, Alabama. I'll know you'll pick wrong no matter what. Your state hasn't sent someone decent to Washington since Hugo Black. The 2018 midterms are also shaping up to be a mess for the Republicans, with Democratic candidate recruiting and enthusiasm at all-time highs. Republicans are also continuing intra-party squabbling, with Senator Dean Heller of Nevada and Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona facing increasingly serious primary challenges on their right. Senator Dean Heller was also recently recorded saying that he was glad the Republican ACA repeal effort failed even after he voted for it. In agency news, federal departments have been revealed to be downplaying the impacts of climate change since the election and are suspected of punishing those who continue to follow the facts. In response, a draft of an interagency report on climate change was given to the press after fears it would be suppressed or altered by Trump appointees. The Department of Justice, under Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, switched sides to back a voter purge in Ohio. Republican elected officials conduct purges of this kind to suppress the votes of minorities and poor people, with many states doing so, and the most prominent example being Florida in 2000, with Katherine Harris and her completely erroneous Texas-Florida felon purge list. On the continuously unfolding Russia scandal, former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort's home was revealed to have been raided by federal agents looking for financial records and information last month. Manafort has also switched legal counsel recently to a firm that specializes in, among other things, financial crimes. This weekend had one of the biggest events of the week in Charlottesville, Virginia. A variety of right-wing and white supremacist groups gathered for an event called Unite the Right, which should really be called a meeting of the National Association for the Advancement of Stupid, Racist Fucking White Trash, or the modern-day German-American Bund. Clashes were started by the right-wing assholes, the area was cleared by police, and Governor McAuliffe has declared a state of emergency. About 2 hours after the first clashes, a car ran into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, with 1 dead and 19 injured. The domestic terrorist in question is, of course, a registered Republican, and evidence indicates that he is a Trump supporter and white supremacist. The DOJ has already opened a civil rights investigation into this case. Furthermore, 2 police officers were killed in Charlottesville when the helicopter they were flying crashed. While details were harder to come by for that incident, it is believed that it was related to the civil unrest. Most Republican officials have made strong statements of condemnation about this act of domestic terrorism. However, Republicans of the past decades have either ignored or endorsed the racism and bigotry that have made the tragic events of this day possible. Trump gave an extraordinarily tepid condemnation of the events in Charlottesville, basically saying that both sides are equally to blame. No. The responsibility for these events, these murders, and these unrest lies solely with the gang of racist morons who, without realizing, make a really great case for the inferiority of white people. This attack follows a long pattern of right-wing terrorism in the United States throughout its history, beginning with the lynchings of the post-Civil War era, to the attacks on black churches and civil rights leaders throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, the 1996 Olympics bombing, the assassination of Dr. George Tiller, the ambush of Pittsburgh police officers in 2009, the 2012 Sikh temple shooting in Wisconsin, the 2015 Charleston shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church, the 2015 Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado Springs, and in this year, the racially motivated stabbing of Timothy Kaufman in New York City, the stabbing of two people in Portland who were trying to protect teenage girls from harassment at the hands of a right-winger, and the recent bombing of a mosque in Minnesota. These are just some of the acts of violence committed by the right against the people of this country. A 2017 GAO report concluded that 73% of fatal extremist attacks since 9/11 were committed by right-wing extremist groups. Our nation's greatest enemies are not North Korea, or ISIS, or Russia, or any other foreign group or ideology. They are the enemy within of right-wing terrorists. They are criminals and extremists who seek to destroy our nation and its institutions. No effort should be spared to defeat their efforts and bring them to justice. But by far, the biggest news of the week is that a recent poll indicates a majority of Republicans would support the delaying of the 2020 presidential election if Trump said we should. American elections have always continued on schedule, even during the height of America's Civil War. To suspend or even postpone our elections is deeply undemocratic, un-American, and spits on the graves of all those in history who sacrificed for our country. Today, we have a State of the Republic special report on the history of the Southern strategy and Republican racism. The reason why this turned into this. Now first, some context about the historical politics of race in America. As Republicans will never tire of saying, Democrats used to be very racist. Race was used to divide poor whites from blacks and prevent them from electing people that would serve the interests of the common man instead of wealthy reactionaries. Southern Democrats used the Klan and Jim Crow laws to systemically disenfranchise black voters. Blacks remained Republicans for many decades, with their traditional loyalty being to the party of Lincoln. However, by the 1930s, black voters were defecting from their traditional Republican loyalties thanks to the positive economic effects of the New Deal. Seeing a political opening, Northern Democrats began to back civil rights in addition to New Deal policies in the hopes of gaining electoral support. Furthermore, the liberals, who were gaining increasing prominence within the Democratic Party, saw civil rights as a moral imperative for the party. The beginning of the transformation of the Democratic Party on civil rights began in earnest in 1948, when future Vice President Hubert Humphrey gave a well-received speech supporting a stronger civil rights plank in the Democratic platform that year.
Friends, delegates, I do not believe that there can be any compromise on the guarantees of the civil rights which we have mentioned in the minority report. In spite of my desire for unanimous agreement on the entire platform, in spite of my desire to see everybody here in honest and unanimous agreement, there are some matters which I think must be stated clearly and without qualification. There can be no hedging. The newspaper headlines are wrong. There will be no hedging, and there will be no watering down, if you please, of the instruments and the principles of the civil rights program. To those who say, my friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. People, human beings, this is the issue of the 20th century.
plank was passed, and in reaction to this, and to the Truman administration's desegregation of the military, Southern Democrats bolted from the party and nominated a separate presidential ticket under the States' Rights Democratic Party label with then-Governor Strom Thurmond.
There's not enough troops in the Army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our...
Southern Democrats hoped to deny President Truman an electoral college majority, forcing the election to the House where they could draw concessions against civil rights. However, the decision backfired when the National Democratic ticket picked up enough votes anyway, showing that nationally Democrats did not have to pick up all of the Solid South to win. In 1960, Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy, who was a Northern pro-civil rights Democrat. In response, Southern Democrats again bolted from the party partially, with Mississippi and Alabama nominating electors unpledged to Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy. Again, Southerners hoped to force some kind of deadlock where Kennedy would have to make concessions to the South in exchange for enough support to be president. This went about as well as the first time they tried it in 1948. Kennedy was able to win an electoral college majority, and Kennedy's victories in the key state of Illinois and Texas put him well over the top and made it unnecessary for him to bargain for Southern support. Kennedy supported civil rights with substantive action, ordering federal marshals into the South to protect protesters, and federalized the Alabama National Guard to prevent segregationist Governor George Wallace from blocking university admissions to black students. Kennedy also backed what would eventually become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, speaking for it publicly.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
Unfortunately, President Kennedy would never live to see a civil rights bill become law because he was assassinated in 1963, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson was from Texas and was widely perceived as a conservative. As Senate Majority Leader, Johnson had previously secured the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act over the filibuster of South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, but he had severely watered down the bill in order to pass it. President Johnson proceeded to defy initial expectations, however, and fully backed a strong civil rights bill. President Johnson managed to jam the 1964 Civil Rights Act through Congress, crushing Southern Democrats' objections. President Johnson signed the act in the presence of congressional and civil rights leaders, making this speech before signing the bill.
Yet those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secure only if each generation fought to renew and enlarge its meaning. From the Minutemen at Concord to the soldiers in Vietnam, each generation has been equal to that trust. Americans of every race and color have died in battle to protect our freedom. Americans of every race and color have worked to build a nation of widening opportunities. Now, our generation of Americans has been called on to continue the unending search for justice within our own borders. We believe that all men are created equal, yet many are denied equal treatment. We believe that all men have certain unalienable rights. Yet many Americans do not enjoy those rights. We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty. Yet millions are being deprived of those blessings, not because of their own failures, but because of the color of their skin. The reasons are deeply embedded in history and tradition and the nature of man. We can understand without rancor or hatred how this all happened, but it cannot continue. Our Constitution, the foundation of our republic, forbids it. The principles of our freedom forbid it. Morality forbids it. And the law I will sign tonight forbids it.
President Johnson knew he was going to lose the South, saying on the night of the bill's passage, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." Needless to say, Southern Democrats reacted extremely negatively to this bill. Further discord occurred at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Pro-civil rights Democrats from Mississippi attempted to be seated as delegates in place of the regular Mississippi delegation, which had been elected in an effectively segregated primary. Eventually, a compromise was worked out, but some Southern delegations refused to play ball, and the Mississippi and Alabama delegations walked out. Further angering the South was President Johnson's pick of Minnesota Senator and prominent civil rights backer Hubert Humphrey as a running mate. That year's Republican nominee was Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was correctly considered an conservative extremist, and his views on a variety of topics were extremely unpopular. Goldwater was feared to be unstable and joked about lobbing nuclear bombs into the Kremlin men's room. Johnson played on those sort of fears with this ad.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
However, Goldwater as a senator had voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and had also received the support of Senator Strom Thurmond, who had by then had switched parties to the Republicans, stating that segregationists had no place in the Democratic Party after LBJ's civil rights legislation and the nomination of Humphrey for the vice presidency. These factors were enough for most of the Deep South to defect from the Democratic Party, despite Goldwater's opposition to much of the New Deal policies that were greatly beneficial and popular in the South. Johnson crushed Goldwater in a 61-38 landslide nationally, with the only state outside of the South that Goldwater won being his home state of Arizona. Moderate Republicans defected en masse from Goldwater, helped along by ads like this.
I don't know just why they wanted to call this a confession. I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican. I've always been a Republican. My father is, his father was. The whole family is a Republican family. I voted for Dwight Eisenhower the first time I ever voted. I voted for Nixon the last time. But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man. This man scares me. Now, maybe I'm wrong. A friend of mine has said to me, listen, just because a man sounds a little irresponsible during a campaign doesn't mean he's going to act irresponsibly. You know that theory, that the White House makes the man. I don't buy that. You know what I think makes a president? I mean, aside from his judgment, his experience, the men behind him, his his advisors, the cabinet. And so many men with strange ideas are working for Goldwater. You'll hear a lot about what these guys are against. They seem to be against just about everything, but what are they for? The hardest thing for me about this whole campaign is to sort out one Goldwater statement from another. A reporter will go to Senator Goldwater and he'll say, Senator, on such and such a day you said, and I quote, blah, 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 whatever it is, end quote. And then Goldwater says, well, I wouldn't put it that way. I can't follow that. Was he serious when he did put it that way? Is he serious when he says he wouldn't put it that way? I just don't get it. A president ought to mean what he says. President Johnson, now, Johnson at least is talking about facts. He says, look, we got the tax cut bill, and because of that you get to carry home X number of dollars more every payday. We got the nuclear test ban, and because of that there's X% less radioactivity in the food. But Goldwater, often you can't, I can't figure out just what Goldwater means by the things he says. I read now where he says, a craven fear of death is sweeping across America. What is that supposed to mean? If he means that people don't want to fight a nuclear war, he's right. I don't. When I read some of these things that Goldwater says about total victory, I get a little worried, you know? I wish I was as sure that Goldwater is against war as I am that he's against some of these other things. I wish I could believe that he has the imagination to be able to just shut his eyes and picture what this country would look like after a nuclear war. Sometimes I wish I'd been at that convention in San Francisco. I mean, I wish I'd been a delegate. I really do, because I would have fought, you know? And I wouldn't have worried so much about party unity, because if you unite behind a man you don't believe in, it's a lie. I tell you, those people who got control of that convention, who are they? I mean, when the head of the Ku Klux Klan, when all these weird groups come out in favor of the candidate of my party, either they're not Republicans or I'm not. I've thought about just not voting in this election, just staying home, but you can't do that, because that's saying you don't care who wins, and I do care. I think my party made a bad mistake in San Francisco, and I'm going to have to vote against that mistake on the 3rd of November.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
In addition, Goldwater won none of the new South states like North Carolina and Texas that were considered more moderate on racial issues. With President Johnson's crushing victory in 1964, he was able to pass much of his legislative agenda, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, public broadcasting, public housing assistance, and much, much more. Johnson laid out his vision for the Great Society thusly.
The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. Your imagination and your initiative and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
Through the passage of Great Society legislation, Johnson sought to extend the benefits of America and its prosperity to non-whites, in particular blacks. Politically, this meant that those kind of social programs became increasingly linked with minorities, generating white hostility. The New Deal was fine because whites were perceived as the primary beneficiaries. The Great Society was not, because minorities were seen as the primary beneficiaries. The fact that much of Great Society legislation benefited everyone was immaterial. The perception was already in the minds of whites that their tax dollars were going to undeserving minorities. By 1968, increasing domestic turmoil combined with the Vietnam War caused America to sour on President Johnson, and he chose not to run for re-election. After the assassination of Robert Kennedy on the night he won the California primary, Vice President Humphrey accepted the Democratic nomination as what is widely regarded as one of the most disorderly conventions in modern history. Republican Richard Nixon returned after his previous defeat in 1960 to run for president again. Nixon noticed that 4 years before, the Deep South had went Republican for the first time as a protest against the passage of civil rights. Nixon's campaign began crafting and using a Southern strategy to appeal to those same conservative Southern whites who had traditionally voted Democratic. Nixon talked about his opposition to forced busing and Great Society spending, and he talked about the quote-unquote silent majority and law and order in order to hopefully peel off enough traditionally Democratic votes to win the South. Complicating matters further was Alabama Governor George Wallace entering the race as a third-party candidate.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Wallace ran a much more explicitly racist and segregationist campaign and split the conservative vote with Nixon. Wallace won much of the South, as well as substantial percentages in the North. However, Richard Nixon's combination of race baiting and treasonous undermining of the Vietnam peace talks was enough to make him president. As president, Nixon twice attempted to nominate Southern conservative justices to the Supreme Court, though both attempts were shot down. Nixon also started the war on drugs for rather political reasons. His own advisor, John Ehrlichman, stated, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Nixon Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman also noted that Nixon, quote, "emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognized this while appearing not to." In 1972, Nixon defeated liberal Democratic Senator George McGovern of South Dakota in a landslide, carrying every state except Massachusetts. The election was the first election where Republicans had been able to fully sweep the South. By 1974, Nixon had resigned from office over the Watergate scandal, and Gerald Ford had become president. Democratic nominee Jimmy Carter was able to temporarily reverse the South's Republican trend as a moderate to conservative white Southern Democratic governor. By 1980, Southerners were increasingly unhappy with Carter for his enforcement of desegregation, particularly the IRS's then recent revocation of tax-exempt status for racially discriminatory religious schools that the South had been using to maintain segregation. Former governor of California and senile savant Ronald Reagan was the Republican nominee in 1980 and ran a strikingly racist campaign against Carter. Reagan had a history of racism as governor of California, backing a state ballot initiative to allow housing discrimination. Reagan kicked off his campaign after the convention by going to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers had been lynched in the 1960s, to give a speech supporting states' rights. Reagan also complained about imaginary Cadillac driving welfare queens and young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. For those who may not be aware, buck was a term used to refer to physically intimidating young black men. Reagan denounced the 1965 Voting Rights Act as, quote, humiliating to the South. This strategy worked quite well, and combined with his treasonous undermining of President Carter's efforts to negotiate for the Iran hostages' release, was enough to elect him president. Reagan, as president, consistently pushed and executed racist policies. Reagan attempted to restore tax exemptions for segregated private schools and also had his DOJ soft-pedal desegregation in general. Reagan consistently fought attempts to sanction the apartheid South African government. Reagan vetoed a bipartisan bill sanctioning the South African government, only to have his veto overridden by both houses of Congress. Reagan sought to politicize affirmative action policies, previously a bipartisan consensus policy designed to help minorities. Reagan's DOJ began attacking it as discriminatory against whites, using ad campaigns and filing cases against it at the Supreme Court. The 1984 GOP platform contained these words: "We will resist efforts to replace equal rights with discriminatory quota systems and preferential treatment. Quotas are the most insidious form of discrimination. Reverse discrimination against the innocent." Needless to say, in this context, innocent meant white. Reagan won re-election by a landslide, carrying nearly two-thirds of whites. By contrast, blacks voted 90% against Reagan. Reagan, in 1987, then vetoed the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which required groups receiving federal funding to be compliant with federal civil rights laws. His veto was again overridden by both houses of Congress. In 1988, with Republican nominee George H.W. Bush behind in the polls, Republicans released attack ads against Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis, associating him with black convicted murderer Willie Horton. The Republican Party pulled out all the stops to convince America that Dukakis was pro-black murderer and anti-white family. A prominent political advisor to both Reagan and Bush was Lee Atwater, who said this about racial politics.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger. You know?
In 1990, South Carolina Republican Senator Jesse Helms, in order to ensure his own re-election, ran the strikingly racist HANDS ad in his re-election campaign against Democratic candidate Harvey Gantt.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
Republicans continued attacks on minorities into the rest of the 1990s, constantly calling for even more tough-on-crime drug policies and more cuts to public assistance, both of which are targeted against racial minorities. By 2000, it was time for Bush the Elder's idiot kid shrub to have a turn in the White House. Bush was considered the frontrunner for the Republican nomination, but John McCain won the New Hampshire primary and was proving to be more of a threat than originally thought. In response, Bush's campaign spread rumors in South Carolina ahead of the crucial primary there that John McCain had an illegitimate black daughter. John McCain and his wife had actually adopted a child from Bangladesh, but the damage was done. McCain was crushed in the South Carolina primary and did not go on to win the nomination. Since the 9/11 attacks, Republicans have gone on xenophobic tirades against Arabs and Muslims, accusing many of them of being terrorists. Republicans have also massively attacked Latino immigrants. Republicans in recent years have duplicated many of the attacks that they used on black people against Latinos, accusing both groups now of being lazy, of mooching off the government, and of being criminals. In 2008, with the candidacy of Barack Obama, all the racists came out of the woodwork. There were allegations that he was Muslim, that he was born in this country, that he was a terrorist sympathizer, that he hated America, that he hated white people, blah, 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 blah. We have a video of it now.
Are you listening?
This is the greatest wealth destruction I've seen by a president.
It'd be like Hitler playing golf with Netanyahu.
I feel like we are talking to the Germans after Hitler comes to power.
This is what Hitler did with the SS.
They're the enemy.
Who's the enemy?
Obama!
You just think he doesn't care, huh?
I think that I really don't.
I think, if I may say so, there's just too many people who are not going to vote for a black candidate, but especially a black angry candidate
who has a deep-seated hatred for white people.
I think he is using racial anxiety for political gain.
This guy is, I believe, a racist.
He did make a very racist comment.
I've got a president who I believe actively dislikes people like me.
We have to bend over, grab the ankles, bend over forward, backward, whichever, because his father was black, because this is the first black president.
Core ties to the African continent.
His having grown up in Kenya.
He is defending racists, and when you defend racism and defend racist acts, it's virtually the same.
Go ahead, say it. Where?
In the hizzy. Do we really have to have him in the white hizzy?
What's with all the hoods in the hizzy?
Kind of a boys in the hood handshake.
This is not the guy that you invite to the White House for poetry reading.
What he's trying to do is to rekindle the sense of black victimization.
How does increasing taxes count as spending cuts in your world, Mr. Obama? Maybe in Kenya.
President say Trayvon could have been me 35 years ago. I guess because what? He was part of the Choom gang and he smoked pot and he did a little blow.
You've decided that chugging a few 40s and rediscovering your Irish is more important.
If he had been anything other than African American, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on African Americans, but he would have been impeached and convicted by now.
He would be impeached if he weren't America's first black president.
I think we're getting close to a high crime and misdemeanor.
I believe he's the most lawless president in modern times.
Former President Richard Nixon, what he did was child's play compared to the range of corruption.
Why wouldn't we impeach this president for not protecting and defending Americans in the bloodbath known as Benghazi?
Pretty much every day has been an impeachable offense.
Can you just show us the birth certificate?
Why wouldn't President Obama release his birth certificate?
God does not have a birth certificate, neither does Obama.
This has clearly been photocopied from a book. You see that? It kind of folds back to almost like the binding of a book.
I've heard that number before, $2 million that he's spending to not have to show the birth certificate.
There's a green border around it that had to be photoshopped in. I'm trying to figure out why they would do
this whole border is suspect.
If he had immigrated here, he'd probably love America more.
A fist bump, a pound, a terrorist fist jab.
The president just seems to be very uncomfortable being commander-in-chief.
Did you see the latte salute?
It's not a latte salute, it's a chai salute.
Our country's less safe today.
He believes the bad guys are the American people.
Barack Obama apparently is willing to roll the dice on that because he made these promises.
Well, he's rolling them. Because if we get hit again, he's through.
There it is again. What is that? That is a flag pin.
You're not wearing a lapel pin, are you?
I will wear one.
They just hate the flag.
Do you notice anything unusual about this picture?
There's no Bible.
President Obama has offered to pay out of his own pocket for the Museum of Muslim Culture.
He's more concerned about protecting the image of Islam than protecting the people of the United States.
And we have a president who is aligned with the jihad force.
You're declaring war on this country with a bunch of jihadis you brought in. You did it, you son of a bitch.
No, he's not a Muslim, he's an atheist.
He's an Arab.
His middle name does matter.
He wants to be known as Barack Hussein Obama.
Here's a person who says he's a Christian. All right, let's take him at face value. Let's just say that that's correct. But what kind of Christian?
Where did he announce it?
I don't know. Where am I announcing things?
I believe that he is a Muslim.
He's not a Muslim.
Well, we don't.
No, he's not.
Well, we do know.
How many of you believe that here?
How many believe?
I do think it's quite possible he is Muslim, even though he says he is Christian.
Why do they think he's a Muslim? Barack Obama's emotional attachment to the Muslim world has hurt the USA. President Obama was soft, almost subservient to the Muslim world. Deep emotional ties to Islam.
I don't hate Obama. He's only been to church like 4 times since he's been president. He golfed 30 times.
President Obama has taken fewer vacation days than Ronald Reagan or Bush the Younger, and you say?
I say he should take more.
Obama's taking a vacation every 5 minutes.
Where's the leadership? On the golf course?
Is this what leadership looks like?
115 or 16 golf outings.
Is he ever working?
Oh, it's not even Marxism. Older than 1848. It was, The man who portrays the devil looks a lot like the President of the United States.
Folks, I've been told this by high-up folks. They say, listen, Obama and Hillary both smell like sulfur. They smell like hell.
We're the young girl saying, no, no, help me, and the government is Roman Polanski.
President Obama who wants mandate circumcision.
I feel like President Obama is just saying, you know what?
Well, our president is frankly out of his mind.
You're a slime ball that hates this country and is allied with a bunch of people wearing nightgowns.
He bashes FNC more than ISIS, and we don't behead anybody.
I just love my country.
The varmint that is currently infesting the Oval Office got started politically by questioning Obama's place of birth. Trump also ran his 2016 campaign with racist attacks against virtually every ethnic group in America. Trump attacked an Indiana-born judge for his family heritage, called Mexicans rapists and murderers, attacked a Gold Star family on the basis of their faith, said to black people, "What do you have to lose?" I mean, what do black people have to lose with Republicans in power besides their right to vote, affirmative action, public assistance programs, their respect, their dignity, and possibly their lives? Since the 2016 election, racists have been emboldened, with hate crimes increasing dramatically since then, including the recent tragic events in Charlottesville, Virginia. America has had a long and disturbing racial history, and Republican politicians still play on racial fears to get elected. Race has always been used to divide people against each other. In the words of President Lyndon Johnson, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on, he'll empty his pockets for you. The only way to stop this is to directly engage and counterattack on these issues. We can no longer afford to allow racial issues to convince the average white person to vote for Republicans who are going to screw them. And us. Furthermore, the spread of these ideas is dangerous to a modern civilized society and encourages terrorism and violence. We must ensure that these ideas do not spread any further. Thank you for watching the program. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting content.